Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you've had a good lunchtime, seen some of our lunch and learn sessions. Don't forget that if you've got a community ticket, you can access all the recordings. They're starting to appear on the platform now under the replay button. That includes all the keynote sessions, but also all of the other lunch and learn and networking sessions for example, this one where we're talking more generally about issues of interest to the community. So now what we're going to talk about ecosystems. So the idea for me in terms of bringing this group together is that AbilityNet as an organisation is a charity based in the UK with lots of connections out around the world. We're one element in a bigger network of connections that we make in terms of all sorts of work that we're doing. So the idea of the ecosystem is that sometimes we're not sure and can't navigate what's going on around us because we're unclear about how big those ecosystems can be and what's in them. Thinking like a Venn diagram about all the crossovers between the people we're trying to work with and support and how that plays out for them. Do we have a common cause, or is it that we're working in similar ways? Often the connection between assistive technology and accessibility isn't necessarily directly connected, for example. Maybe it's simply disability, which is the core of that conversation. So what we've got here is a great panel of people that I know well and really enjoy talking to. So I think we're going to fill this hour very comfortably, who come from different parts of different ecosystems and connections, and all have a crossover in some way, probably in their work. You know, if we started to explore the connections between the individuals, I'm sure we'd find the connections. What I'm interested in today really is just the examples of how your world is working and what the connections are in the ecosystem, and particularly where are the priorities in the sense of making change happen, whether we're talking sort of social or broader changes in the community, or whether it's specifically around disability. So we're going to have a chance to hear from everybody, and then I think we're going to just talk a little bit more about what people in the audience may think are the sort of areas that they're looking to build connections and what we can learn from that. So Sumita, I'm going to come to you first. I'd like you to tell people about the Zero project and a little bit more about the work that you're doing in particular, because I think that's a really interesting place to start, because it's relatively new in that space for you. So.
Thank you so much for that, Mark. Hi, everyone. My name is Sumita, and I'm the head of civil society at the Zero project. For those of you who are not sure what we do, essentially, to put it in a nutshell, we bring people together. And we build networks across the world and kind of reduce efforts when it comes to replicating startups or policies or practices that are already existing out there. And how we do this is that each year we have a thematic focus, either on education, employment, accessibility, or on civil society participation. And what we do is we highlight innovative policies and practices in our annual conference that will be taking place next year in February, and we connect people. We get startups talking to potential funders, we get funders talking to civil society organizations, and one thing we've kind of realized, and this is not a challenge that's unique to any one country, but it's actually pretty global, is that civil society, governments, corporations, individual advocates, people are not talking to each other, and that's what we hope to achieve. We hope to build these bridges, bring people together in a common room, in a common theme, to really get these conversations going. And that's what we do at the Zero project.
Cool. And so the scale of what you're doing there, I mean, how many you're giving awards, and this year I think it was 75.
It's 75, yeah.
So that's the scale of what you're doing, and it's global in its sort of purpose. It's trying to find and connect and support people who are doing interesting and engaging stuff under those theme areas. What's a typical organisation that you're thinking of look like and feel like in the sense of? I mean, I'm sure there are so many different examples,
yeah.
But the types of things you're working with most closely at the moment. Can you give us a sense of what type of organisation that is that you're really looking to support?
Sure. Well, my portfolio mainly is with civil society, and that means that's about 70–80% of the projects that we get through. The type of organizations that we're thinking of are really organizations that are innovative in their thinking, and organizations that particularly include people with disabilities at the very get-go, at the very initial stages of planning up until the very end stages of product development and the design cycle. What's a typical organization? That's a little bit tricky to answer, because, you know, we've had organizations from South Sudan that have developed ramps out of bamboo, or we have, multi-million-dollar organizations coming out of the US. So what is typical is a rather tricky answer for me to give. But I think what is common amongst all of these organizations is that they are innovative in their way of thinking, and that they're open to collaborating and open to working together. And I think this is something that really is a common thread throughout all of the innovations that we see each year.
Well, thank you. And just finally, the stuff you're talking about is not just European. I know that the conference is in Vienna, but you're actually now at the stage of growing beyond that point. Either the global element of what you're doing is your particular sort of angle on that. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So just as a bit of a sneak peek, we are actually launching into India pretty soon. So right now, what we hope to achieve is that, with rising costs of travel, we have also come to realize that there are more and more innovations out there that deserve their time in the limelight. And what this means is that instead of expecting them to come to us, we need to go to them. And this is why we are launching Zero Project India. We already have a partnership in the Latin America space together with Fundación Descúbreme. And so, yes, there's lots of potential out there for us to explore into the Asian markets, African markets for sure, to really go where the people are and to go where the innovations are being rolled out. And so this is precisely what we do. So if there are people out there, and I'm just doing a quick call out there, keen to know what we do and would love to work with us, I would be more than happy to speak with you after the session.
Well, thank you, Sumita, and we'll be back round to find out more about where the priorities are as well. That probably brings us quite neatly to you, Sara, because that crosses over geographically, if nothing else. But so, could you tell us a bit about the work that you're doing in emerging markets, and in particular, the connection into stuff like Zero Project? What does that represent in your ecosystem? How does that fit with their stuff they're working on? What's the crossover in the sense of how that engages from your point of view?
Right. Thank you. So. I work at Google, and I was thinking I probably don't need to talk about what our company does, but given this panel, I went to Wikipedia to see how they summarize Google. And they say that Google is a multinational company focusing on search, engineering, tech, online advertising, computer software, and AI. Google's mission is to organize the world's information, make it universally accessible and useful. We have had that mission from the very beginning. Love it. We capitalize on that accessibility piece all the time in any of our presentations. I joined Google in 2015, and my initial focus was making Google maximally accessible for employees. In terms of the goals of this session and talking about ecosystem, that's one set of ecosystem influencing that I needed to do. But my primary focus now, as you said, is driving accessibility and disability into emerging markets like India, like Africa, like Brazil. So it's a different focus, and therefore the ecosystem has changed as well. Google does have, a plethora of assistive technologies and, accessibility features on top of our existing technologies. And so my mission is to make sure that it is known about in emerging markets, to make sure that we, that people are aware of it and that we are deploying it, and to the extent possible, we are modifying our technologies to make them better suited, for emerging market countries. So there's a whole set of influencing that I need to do there. One is increasing the profile of this work, because Google has historically focused more on Western countries. So how do we kind of, increase the attention, interest, and passion? And it's sort of interesting, of course, for those of us that are in this, it seems like so painfully obvious. Like, of course, this is where we need to be focusing our attention. But moving a big ship like Google, it's a big ship, and so it takes time to turn it and get alignment and so on. And so partners like Zero Project are so critical. I mean, we have, and similarly with Access Israel, we've gone to these various events, and that has given us a lot of exposure and connections, and has actually spawned a large piece of the ecosystem that we are now using to establish partnerships in these other countries, because we also recognize as we try to drive Google assistive technology, accessibility technology in emerging markets, we need partners on the ground. And so these amazing organizations have created those relationships for us.
And so, because I think this will become something we come back to, are you primarily thinking about the ecosystem there as being people who are already in our gang, who are already talking about accessibility and inclusion? Is that your stepping stone to people who aren't? I mean, you're describing how difficult, it's self-evident to us, that that was what I was thinking. How do you connect and bridge out to people who are going, well, what's this all about and why should it be important? Is that another part of your ecosystem you're trying to connect in a different way, or is this a route to that, do you think?
So yes, so certainly, within the Google sphere, it is, amplifying the importance of focusing, on these regions, and then all of these partnerships created again through these various NGOs. Christopher corrected me. Charities, as I think is a more UK appropriate term. They are providing us with access to communities that we can test with so that we can evaluate our technologies. They're providing us with feedback, so a lot of input into our products, a lot of relationships on the ground in terms of if we actually do want to, we do a lot of user experience research. And so these are the entities that provide us with the user base. That then gives us credibility when we come back to our own ecosystem and try to do the evangelizing. Yeah,
I think that's a really nice example of something that people looking in wouldn't think of Google having that problem, almost. Who's going to test our products for us? That, almost that's not the starting point. You'd think that this would be where the ecosystem plays a role. So it's just showing that the different parts of the ecosystem have different problems they're solving when they're trying to work together. Just beginning to illustrate the difference between that and what Zero Project's trying to achieve, but the crossover being, hey, there's something that we're doing that you would find helpful, and we're beginning to build that relationship. And as I say at the beginning, I'm more aware now of how complicated that is, but also the points of contact and connection that are there that people may not know about, that they can seek out, particularly if they're listening in, go and talk to people, find out where the connections are, rather than waiting for them to come to you. But also, look, they're quite unexpected in their nature sometimes. So I really like that example. Thank you.
Thank you.
Michal, I'm going to come to you. I'm going to go carry on the flow. Sara mentioned Access Israel. Can you tell us a bit about what Access Israel does, and also your ecosystem? Because we talked about this. You've got multiple parts there. Can you give us an example of something that you lean on quite heavily in terms of the ecosystem that you're part of?
So Access Israel has been established, was established 23 years ago in an Israel that was not accessible at all. And I think relating to the ecosystem discussion...
Oh, sorry, can I just interrupt you, Michal? I realise there's no BSL, that we've got a problem with the technology, apparently. So just for anybody trying to use BSL, I'm hoping that the captions can reassure you that we realise that it's not working. And obviously we'll fix that as quickly as we can. But that's why the caption is looking as puzzled as I am, because it's not working, apparently. So sorry to interrupt.
No problem. So I think that when Access Israel was established in Israel, not only was Israel not accessible, but I think that it was them and us. It was the organizations, the NGOs or charities, as Sara just taught me, and it was the business section. I think that the interaction was that of begging, of pity, of please help us, or on the contrary, knocking on the table and demanding. The discussion, they didn't speak the same language. And I think that one of the stories before I came to Access Israel was when Yuval started understanding the win-win-win. I mean, it's a win-win situation if you are accessible. An accessible business is a more profitable one. And when he started knocking on doors and visiting CEOs, this was a really fresh idea, at least in Israel. And CEOs, we have stories of CEOs telling him, we have the security waiting outside for the first knock on the table to take you out. You're talking our language, now we're ready to hear. And I think that is what Access Israel started doing. Before regulations came into place in Israel, Access Israel was successful in bringing along large organizations, medium organizations, to do accessibility. It was before there was any regulations telling how to do it, but we did it from a way of user experience. This is what is needed. Let's do it. And it will be good for you and for them. And the minute we started that, I think that was the beginning of the ecosystem. The ecosystem included people with disabilities, organizations. At a certain point, we had 1,200 customers, organizations that we consulted, that we helped. And at a certain point, we said, there's a market now. There's a market of outside consultants. We're not a business. I want to give them the opportunity to thrive. So we basically chose the benchmarkers, the ones that once we know they are accessible, everybody else will just, step along and reach that level of accessibility. Today, we are living in an Israel that the law is very elaborate and very strong. It's also a law with teeth, so there is also enforcement. And I think the business world in Israel, there's always room for improvement. I have job security. I always say it. I said it in the previous panel I was on. But there's discussions now. The business community, the NGOs, I can even say there were banks in Israel. ATMs were accessible many years ago, like 5-6 years ago. But all of a sudden we found out that it's great that it's accessible. People with disabilities, blind, didn't know about it. Yeah. Nobody told them. So the ecosystem all the time, it's all about communication, listening, not just hearing, but listening to what the needs are and making that common ground and common language.
Mm. But also, interestingly, being clear about your role in it. As you said, at a certain point, you're going, well, that's not for us to do, but we want to make sure that there is stuff happening. So it's not, we're not taking that on. The ecosystem is about that partnership and relationship and understanding the fit just as much as I've got to do it all myself. It's exactly the opposite of that. It's understanding your particular role in that. And so looking now at where you're working at the moment, are there examples of where you've really clearly established your role and you're working alongside those other partners? I'm thinking of the startup spaces and stuff that I know that you're engaged in.
So Access Israel was the first one, I think, in Israel to do the consulting, to develop a model where businesses know how to become more accessible. Today there's, as I said, a market for it. We're still there. We're still players in that market, hopefully great players. We bring along, Israel is known as the startup nation, so we try to make the shift into the accessible startup nation. So we do, again, we're listening to what the ground needs, what the businesses need, what people with disability needs, and then talk to the technologies and urge to continue and develop what is needed, not just what is profitable or what is out there, and create this system. So we are, many times people with ideas come to us, talk to us, understand the feasibility of it, the demand for it. We assist in trying to give advice on how to go to the right way, and then providing platforms. We have, I told you that when we spoke before, in Israel there's a legal requirement for any organization with more than 25 employees that provides services to the public to have an accessibility director. Okay, now that's a lonely person. That's a one person in an organization that has to lead a very important thing for 20% of the population. So what we did is we created, first of all, a forum of such coordinators. And again, we're listening to what their needs are, what their difficulties are, and then we're able to do the connections also with technologies, with other NGOs or whatever. But it's really creating and facilitating the listening part and solution finding part of whatever is out there.
It sounds. I guess when you're describing it that way, what you're doing, though, is you're also having to enable and continually grow the ecosystem. It's actually part of your role to be constantly aware of the different things that are going on and connect them up. It's not just simply that we're sitting in the middle. When you need this, we've got it. You're actually continually and growing and enabling that.
And our connection is that it's not just Israel. The whole idea is this international community. We're all talking. We're all communicating. We're all, the fact that I can take my phone and call you up, or call Hector up, or call Google up, Sara, and really say, hey, there's a need, or I want to connect you. This is something that makes this ecosystem something that organizations and NGOs and technologies want to be part of. It becomes a place where they want to be part of, and I think the togetherness is what pushes it to success.
Yeah. So, Klaus, Access Austria, It's a clone of Access Israel, presumably.
No, not really. Yeah.
Tell me more about what you're doing, because you're particularly right now looking at the sort of innovation and startup-y
Yes,
stuff, aren't
yes,
you,
yes.
of that bigger picture. But this ecosystem, as it includes Access Israel, what's the similarities and differences in what you're doing?
No, first, let me say, Access Austria is not a clone from
No,
Access
I
Israel,
apologize.
but the brand name is a very simple name, because the other name we have is HGBS, and it's unexplainable to a person outside of Austria what this does mean. We exist since 1935, so we are a long-standing organization, and we have gone through this process that was described by Michal. Yeah, we were one of these charity organizations begging for funds to help people with disabilities and to give them the opportunity to be in a parallel market, in a parallel universum. Not to be part of the normal society, but to live on the edge of the society. Yeah? And when I became the CEO of HGBS, I decided that we have to do another thing. We have to bring accessibility, and we have to bring persons with disability in the core of the society. And to bring them in the core of the society means to enable them to be a part of the economic system, part of the primary economic system. And that's the reason why I'm sitting here. The reason why I'm sitting here is also the connection to Suna, because Zero Project was, I'm a so-called ambassador of Zero Project. I'm engaged in Zero Project since 2014, and Zero Project brought us all together. So I got to know Hector, I got to know Michal, I got to know all the other organizations, and okay, there are some parallel streams, but that's the mainstream. Yeah? We are all connected together via Zero Project. That's a reason why we are sitting here. Yeah? And the other thing is what Sara says. Yeah? Yes, we are the guys who are doing the testing. We are the grassroots organization. We are the DPO, because we have, when you compare it, for example, to Israel, we are comparable in population. We have about 8.5 million inhabitants, and we have about 12,000 legally blind persons in Austria, and 7,500 members in our organization. So if Michal or anyone needs some organizations to test new products, new services, they come to us, and I can say, okay, let's try to find the appropriate person to test it. And the next thing is, then I found out it's not enough. It's not enough only to promote it. Yeah, it's good that we are connected all together via Zero Project and know that there are products outside, but perhaps something there should some kind of mechanism to transfer the knowledge, to transfer all the company knowledge that are in another company, for example, to Europe. And we are in Europe, or we are members of the European Union. Okay, why don't try to find companies, to find organizations, to find persons that have a minimum viable product, which can be tested by the customers, yeah, to help them to enter to the European market. Okay. Perhaps to be able to share the profits that they have. When they have a bigger share of profit in the European Union, then they can sell the products at a cheaper price and lower income countries, yeah? Because that's always the biggest problem that we have seen. Yeah? The affordability of assistive technology. There is so much assistive technology outside, yeah, but nobody can afford to buy it. Yeah? There is an Israeli company, for example, which is very famous for screen reading, or not screen reading, for OCR, and then read out loud technology, but it costs 5,400 euros. Yeah, 5,400. Nobody can afford it outside of Austria and Germany. Yeah?
And so what's the work that you're doing in the sense of, so you're partnering up in the ecosystem sense, I'm thinking. You're saying, we're inside the EU, you need a point of entry into this marketplace. It's a big marketplace. It's valuable to you in terms of getting this right. I'm the point of entry where I understand what you're trying to do and I can provide you with support for that. And also, I guess you're saying, and by the way, I'm part of a bigger family and connections where we can enable other stuff to go. So is that a relatively recent program that you started?
I can tell the people that are coming in, I'm your mentor.
Right.
I will try to connect you to other organizations, to other parts of the world. Perhaps it's not suitable for Europe. Yeah? But we are also working together, for example, with the city of Vienna, to help them to establish really legally their business in Austria. Okay. Yeah? And when they have the branch in Austria, then we can go to different donators, or we can go to different funding organizations and say, okay, there is a company who wants to establish themselves in Austria. They will, let's say, hire 5 people, pay them, for example. And the other thing is we are working together with all the others and ask them, is it possible that it would be better to transfer this company to another company or to another country? Is it scalable, for example? And after 1 year, when they're here, when they're established, then we can ask some of our sources if they want to donate them, or not donate them, if we want to give them money on a basis like a startup money, as a share of the company.
Cool. And I think that's interesting. The innovation element of that is clearly where the development is driven in and saying, well, we're trying to make something new happen. Yeah. And as you say, I guess in the sense of the ecosystem, you're almost like a navigator. You're helping them find their way around. Yeah. And I think that comes back to all of us saying, well, we're finding these connections and we're making use of them both for ourselves and for others. And that jumping around. Hector, I'm going to ask you to talk about something that's really outside all of the ecosystems we're talking about, I think, because the stuff that we were just chatting about is to do with how you connect internally with an interface out to your external customers, which I think is really interesting. A whole ecosystem out there who aren't talking about accessibility, not concerned about inclusion, don't really understand disability, hardly even know what to say about it. And you're finding a route out to that through your internal ecosystem, I think, which I think is really powerful as well.
Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Hector Minto. I'm the lead accessibility evangelist for Microsoft, and my role is to essentially do that stakeholder mapping within all of our markets around the world to help understand how to create a local plan to deliver more accessibility. Now, lots of different aspects to that, but the thing I've learned most in the 6 years is the convening power that big brands have to bring people to the table to have this type of conversation. I mean, I couldn't believe it genuinely, like 2 years into Microsoft, that I was probably into my second disability minister by then, to have this conversation about the role of technology and the inclusion of people with disabilities. And yet, 25 years working in the field before that, no one had ever done that to me. Yeah? So it's like the people who really cared about disability tech and are innovating it and struggling to get share of voice there, I walk into Microsoft and it's like, yeah, come on, of course we'll talk to you about disability and technology. Right, so how do we leverage that convening power we have and then start driving more influence to see if, what we can get to happen out there? So we have 15 markets around the world at Microsoft. I have teams in each who are all essentially working out what that stakeholder map looks like. And arguably, the most important stakeholders within that are the technology industry that are delivering technology in the world in those markets. And they do not know about accessibility. Let's just get this super clear. Yeah, there's a dearth of knowledge. There are pockets of brilliance. But essentially, we take it as our role to really support that tech industry to learn and to be humble about what they don't know, and then to start looking at, frankly, the commercial advantage of getting out on the front foot on disability inclusion. In a society that's going to rely on technology more and more so, whether it's banking, healthcare, education, inaccessible products are just not going to sell in the future, right? Because the physical bricks and mortar are going to become less and less available to people. So these platforms that are being built, from automotive to education to retail, accessibility is going to be more and more required, and there's going to be more and more government focus on it. So we, as the responsible kind of partners of our ecosystem, we've got to help those partners start their journey and give them permission to be humble about what they don't know, and allow them to jump on board with us. And so I've spent a lot of time working with what we call our partner network around the world. and to get them to buy in, make commitments to disability. And thankfully, we have amazing engines like the UK Disability Confidence Scheme, Disability In, Valuable 500, helping them recognise that there is an ecosystem of businesses interested in this topic for them to go and deliver against. If you think about the most basic type of Microsoft seller out there, they're helping people adopt our products. Upgrade to the latest version of Windows, move to Microsoft Teams, whatever it might be. What we're getting with these companies out there is this realization that they can use disability inclusion and more inclusion, the wider topic of inclusion, as a driver to go and have those conversations. So that's one. Are you adopting our products in the way that we invest in them? We don't. When we make our products accessible, we want people to actually use the accessibility features, right? Yeah. But we've got a whole industry out there selling the product that's not talking to people about those investments we make. So we're doing a lot of education with our partners to get them confident to go and have these conversations. And then when you move to more of the built infra partners, the people who are building other people's technology, their biz apps, their websites, their products, we're getting them to recognize the benefits of disability inclusion in terms of what they're building out there as well, and starting to drive conversations in their own industry. And some of the things that help us there in terms of drivers and motivators are things like European Accessibility Act is going to mean the digital deliverables of a wider group of industries are going to need to be accessible. So our role is essentially to find, if I think about the UK, for example, we have like 5,000 employees in the UK, 500,000 work within the Microsoft ecosystem. But they're the people I need to be telling to get to talk about accessibility. So we can do so much as Microsoft directly. What we're trying to do now, more and more so, is encourage all of our partner networks around the world to go and innovate. And so some of the things you're talking about, innovating net new assistive technology is one angle, but actually just making the products they already have and are selling out there increasingly accessible and recognize some of the responsibilities we want of them. There's some tips and tricks that might help. Executive sponsorship in my world makes a huge difference. So one of the things that you realize is we'll have somebody who's in charge of the partner ecosystem in a market. Well, they don't know about disability and accessibility. So my role is to go and help that partner manager understand that there's this thing called accessibility and that they can go and do that work. As soon as I get executive buy-in to the topic, they start driving their program. I step back. Yeah? And because we've built lots of collateral, it becomes more and more self-serve the more we try to drive it out. We're still really at the start of what's possible. But yeah, I think if we're ever going to crack accessibility, we've got to widen our net, right? And that's not just industry. At the industry level, we need to widen our net. Some of the things I'm most delighted of in the last 6 years is companies who you would think have nothing to do with disability inclusion are buying in. Yeah, I love it. I think like Unilever are a great example. Done some great work in this space. But when you think about Unilever, you're not thinking, oh, disability product. You're just thinking product. I'm just thinking Marmite, right? Okay. But the point is they then started looking at deodorants that were physically accessible. They created that. All of those conversations towards that product started with us having a conversation with them about disability inclusion, and then they went and did their bit. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, evangelism's one role, right? You've got to have amazing evangelists like Michal, telling people this matters. But eventually what you've got to have a conversation with them is like, what's your product and what are you doing? Like, what noise are you making out there? How are you supporting the inclusion journey, particularly when it comes to digital?
Well, I think what's interesting when we were talking about this is, in a sense, we're describing ourselves as being the evangelists and the community. Somebody who turns up to an event about accessibility is probably already in the game.
Absolutely.
And the people who don't turn up don't care that there's a conference going on and don't even know what it's to do with because they don't recognise its role in their world. And that ecosystem is bigger than our ecosystem. As complicated and as mixed up as we are in our cosy corner of our gang, there's all this world out there that's not listening. And I think that stuff, I'm just got it in front of me here. I can't work out how to paste it into the chat, actually, that's what I'm trying to do. The tips and tricks, what you're doing there, which I think is interesting, and others in the panel won't know this necessarily, I think you're trying to get your account managers who are there, trying to build a relationship. So their job is to build a relationship with the customer. Yep. Hector turns up and says, hey, you should be talking about accessibility. Well, I've never heard of it. Well, why would I do that? Yeah. You want to build a relationship with the customer. The other bit of it that was really interesting is telling the account manager that there is something called Valuable 500. Yeah. And that the person on the other end's CEO has signed up to this is then the beginning of the conversation where both ends of the conversation are going, okay, not only is this person calling got to know something about it, the person on the other end's going, oh, I don't even know what that is, and my boss is on it. You're starting to force that conversation to happen. I like that element of the ecosystems coming together at that point. And I was just going to mention the tips and tricks is actually the person on the call ringing from Microsoft, in a sense, saying, I don't feel confident about that conversation, Hector. You say, well, don't worry, there's some resources here that will help you begin that conversation. That's a whole world away from us talking to one another. Yeah. It's putting it out there into these other worlds. And I suspect we're all trying to do that in different ways at different times.
We learned a long time ago that if you try and get somebody to attend a three-day course on accessibility, they're not coming. No. If you ask them to have a 3-minute conversation at the end of a conversation about something else, they'll have that conversation. Yeah. And so we coached all of our sales teams to essentially say, I know we were talking about security for the last 2 hours, but can I just show you this immersive reader in the browser to support people's reading ability? They do it for 30 seconds at the end, and they then find there's a really interesting conversation they've started. Yeah. So it's all about kind of starting that conversation. So that's one thing. The bit about the Valuable 500, just to kind of give you an insight into kind of what way we think about it. We're constantly trying to, in terms of getting people to buy into disability inclusion. If you meet your average CIO responsible for the technology across the whole business, and you say, let's talk about accessibility, like they've heard about that word once in the past, and it's like, oh, this feels like hard work. Yeah, right, okay. But when you sit there and say, look, your chief exec has literally said, we want to make the disability experience in our business great for our employees, the CIO then is on the hook for delivering that. And we as Microsoft can then turn around and go, look, we're here to help. How can we help? Yeah. So there's, it's all about recognizing the psychology of the people involved in the conversation and then getting them to do, their bit. It's not always IT, by the way.
No. No, clearly, yeah. Well, the customer experience stuff and the retail experience, all the parts of that are fit together. And you describe different industries for whom the tech is going to be an enabler of some other thing completely different. I think that's what's interesting. Sumita, I'm going to come back round because I think that from the point of view of Zero Project, presumably yours is more broadly around disability. It's not just about tech, for example. But presumably you're also having those conversations with people to try and explain why anybody would try and fix a problem they'd never heard of before. I'm assuming that's part of your daily routine in some sense. I don't quite understand what this is all about. I don't know quite why Zero Project would exist. So how do you connect into that messaging stuff that Hector's talking about in your ecosystems? Who are you communicating with who just literally don't understand why you're doing it? Who's on the other side of the coin that you're trying to connect with in your day-to-day work?
I would say probably the biggest proportion of people we have to tend to convince would be governments or policymakers. I think that's where there's a bit of a breakdown because, with disability, every single person comes across it in their daily life in one shape, form or another, either with direct family members or friends or, on being various parts of, your life journey. But for some reason, when it comes to policymakers, that's where there's a bit of a gap. And that's where most of our conversations take place. Because very often in a lot of countries, I think accessibility tends to fall into the social and family development ministries or the welfare ministries. It's not really thought of as a national security issue, or it's not really thought of as a sort of a general population issue. Very, very often it's meant as a social and welfare issue meant for a particular demographic of people who already have a disability. So I think very often what we have to do is also convince people within governments, people within policymaking spheres, is that disability is not something that they can avoid. We are all going to have acquired disabilities at some shape, form, or another. Also, when you negate disabilities, you negate essentially 15% of the population, and that's a huge number. And how do you plan for population gathering or population data management, for example, when you're ignoring essentially 15% of it? That's a huge statistic. So this is where our conversations take place, and a lot of times we've realized that, in the rooms, just as in the room we are in right now, everyone's a convert. Like, I don't need to convince Hector or Michal or Klaus or Sara that disability is an important thing. We're all talking to the same people. Next year at the conference, we're all going to be seeing each other again. So we are constantly talking to the same people. And I feel like this is where we really need to be a little bit shameless and talk about disability to people who aren't convinced. And this is where we really have to go out and bang on the walls and bang on the doors, like what Michal says, and talk about disability and bring disability into the forefront of it. And this is where we're also kind of trying to really breach into, for example, businesses. Tech businesses, yes, you guys are leading it because everyone uses tech in their everyday lives. But, let's talk about finance, for example. Finance companies are still very much in the traditional brick and mortar ways of working. It's very hard to convince finance companies to think about accessibility or what accessibility means to them. And so we've had to really, break down and have these conversations, and how we've kind of tackled these conversations is like what Hector says. You talk about something that they know, and then you kind of sneak in something that you want to talk about. You kind of a ninja your way into that. So it's hard work, and it's work that keeps on having to happen. But I'd like to say that in the past, I've been in the disability world much shorter than everyone else on the panel. It's only been about 7 years now. But what I've realized is that we're sort of in this nascent stage of transitioning, and I think the conversations are a lot easier these days, especially after COVID. The pandemic, for as horrible as it was and terrible for a lot of people, it really brought about and forced companies to think about accessibility literally overnight. When offices had to shut down, people had to take their work home. Suddenly, non-accessible jobs were accessible. They could be done from home. They could be done from your bedroom or anything like that. So, hopefully we don't have to wait for another pandemic before we have more conversations like this. And I think that, it's fantastic to see really how this has morphed throughout the last couple of years. And I'm just hoping that this momentum really keeps going, especially also within the global south, where, it is still very inaccessible. It is still not in the forefront of people's minds, and conversations definitely need to happen. And I do urge companies like Google, like Microsoft, large MNCs that have headquarters or offices in these very much inaccessible spaces to really keep the conversations going there. And we'd love to work with you, of course. So, yeah.
Cool, thank you. Klaus, I'm going to come back round. I think I'm wondering in where you are right now, who are you trying to convince? Where do you find the barriers in the sense of people understanding how much further you can take your work? So in your ecosystem, looking at the relationships around it, where's the hardest conversations? Is it the government support for particular programs? Is it the partnership or the investors or whatever? Where are you finding that challenge in the ecosystem?
I fully agree with that, what Sumita said. The problem is, and I want to enforce it, we are sitting in the bubble. We have to go out of the bubble. We have to convince the policymakers. We have to convince not only the policymakers, we have to convince the guys or let's say the departments that have the money. Yeah? I can give you an example. On Monday I had the opportunity to be in Frankfurt at the German Mobility Congress, and they are talking about 100 billions of euros, which has to be spent for public transport in Germany, railway, blah 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 blah. Yeah, nobody mentioned in one sentence, in one phrase, person with disabilities. Yeah, there is nothing about it. There's nothing about it, but they're talking about tons and tons of money. Yeah. They're talking about the last mile, they're talking about whatever, and one of the most interesting things that were mentioned there was, I don't know, Mr. Knie, it was Mr. Knie, a professor from Berlin, He mentioned, we make our decisions on the basis of statistics and basis of data that are not relevant. We don't know anything about it, Is it only in Berlin? When you look to Berlin, we are talking, when we talk about the population there, then we talk about, okay, we have the man, female, two-child family. Only 12%, of all marriages, in Germany are in this kind, Right. And that's the same thing that we have in talking with people outside of our bubble, because they don't know anything about the reality that we are facing every day. We have to convince them that this is a normal business where they can earn money, because 20% of the population, they want to spend money. They are voters. If it's not real money, then it's money in kind of power to engage politicians or political parties. Yeah? And I think that's the angle that we have to go to. Yeah. And one more sentence. Yeah? Because yesterday I spoke with Michal. Yeah? We have to go outside. We have to go outside to the so-called real world. Yeah, to the big associations, to the big conferences, for example, which are dealing with money. Yeah. And if they are not talking about accessibility, yeah, let's storm in. Yeah, let's say, okay, let's talk about disability. Let's talk about people with disabilities. You're excluding 20% of the population. Yeah?
So in a policy sense, we were talking about this in the session earlier, the policy could apply to any element of policy. So you've spoken about transport there, and we were talking earlier, it could be about education, it could be in the workplace. I think that the challenge in looking outside the ecosystems, given that we're painting ourselves in a corner at the moment, it's complicated enough in the bits we're in. Of course, it could be anything out there. I wonder whether there's any priorities that you think within the ecosystem, whether it's transport's an interesting one, is it workplace, is it education? Michal, in the stuff you're doing, you do have influence over policy in Access Israel, and you have had that. Is there a particular angle that you think can be a focus for that in the sense of where you are now? Employment or transport?
With your permission, I want to touch on two things that were mentioned here and get back to what you're asking. First of all, we are all talking about not preaching to the preachers going out. But wait, let's talk about the preachers for a second, because one of the things that I found out when I joined Zero Project community and started talking to organizations, to Klaus's and to Hector's and to Sara's, and first of all, I understood that what we're doing in our neck of the world is being done in other places. So let's first of all make sure that the preachers are not reinventing wheels, are talking to each other, are making sense. As Klaus says, if there's something that I want to check and think about, he's a guy that I'll go and brainstorm with. And I think that, we are all talking now about going out of the bubble, but let's also keep the ecosystem within the bubble more efficient and more, keep the independence of the uniqueness of each and every one of us, but still move forward in a way that will be more productive. That's one thing. Another thing, and relating to what Hector said, I think that basically what Hector was mentioning, he's shifting the light that is, it's coming and saying we already have these solutions on accessibility. Let's just mention them. Let's just bring them to the table. And it reminded me that when we started, I was saying that the Israeli law requires the coordinator of accessibility, the director of accessibility. That in most municipalities and organizations, at the beginning, who was nominated for the job? The infrastructure person. Why? Because accessibility was physical. So they all the time took, yeah, we have it. He's the guy. But hey, accessibility is so much more than that. And I think in a way what we're doing in our community, in our, the community of accessibility advisors and the organizations that we're talking to, we're coming and saying, let's go internally into the organization. That's the Access Israel model. Let's learn. And let's show the organization how each and every department has something to do with accessibility. It's not the HR thing. It's not the infrastructure thing. You have accessibility aspects in each and every part of this. So it's not just staying in the preach the preacher. It's outside of the bubble, both internally, as you said, in the organizations. And I can tell you that one of the, when I talk about my job, one of the things I love about my job is that we're in a field where you see the results of what you're doing. You see the change. And you see now more and more organizations understanding that. And Klaus, as Klaus mentioned, we are going to storm the outside of the bubble world. That's our plan for the next year, and maybe use this amazing platform of TechShare Pro with everybody listening. And I understand it's a great year of attendance and participations. Let's make sure that even in conferences that are non-accessibility related, this is on the table, because eventually, all the businesses want one thing: profit. So let's make sure the profit is making use of the 100% potential of customers. And you can't do it without us. So,
Sara, can I just want to come to you because I think that you've got experience, because you were talking earlier about the stuff firstly being around employees, inward facing. And now maybe your role is slightly more outward facing. Are there common ground there in the way that Michal is saying, you know, we've got to speak out to the people who aren't necessarily converted or even understand what we're talking about? Are there similar conversations that you've become used to, almost that you're instinctively drawing upon to get that conversation flowing in the way that Hector said about the account managers having to, just at the end, I'm just going to mention this thing you haven't thought of. What are your tips and tricks to people to begin those conversations that both internally and externally, I guess, is the challenge, isn't it?
Right. And, you know, there are a lot of similarities because, for example, internally, obviously, the community of people with disabilities at Google are all bought in. But what you're trying to do is get all of the technology developers that are building things for the Googlers with and without disabilities get bought in. So there's a major training piece, and also at these companies, since there is turnover, you have to do it and then you have to do it again. It's not a once and done. When you have successes, you need to go as public as you can so that everybody else starts to see, like, wow, marketing people see when good things happen in accessibility, it adds luster. So that, you know, senior leadership sees when we do these things, it makes Google look good. Or another thing, of course, that's relevant, whether you're focusing external products, or focusing on the internal use case, is the leadership buy-in that Hector mentioned earlier. And I think both of us are fortunate in that we have had leadership buy-in and leadership coming out publicly saying that this is important. And that's critical. That's the start. If that doesn't happen, you may not move forward. But certainly at Google, that's not it. You need to have top-down support. You need to have bottom-up support. You need to have side-to-side support. It needs to come from all angles. Maybe if you don't have it at the leadership, none of the rest of it will happen. But only leadership is not going to be, adequate. In terms of some tips and tricks and some barriers, so I've mentioned perseverance. None of this is going to be easy, and you need to be willing to do it again and again. Another tip and trick: connecting with like-minded groups, like the communities that we have here, to share best practices. Also, what we see even in the tech communities, we might be competing on various dimensions, but we have all agreed that in accessibility, we are completely collaborative. We're trying to lift these boats. We are all dealing with the same issues. Keeping the community in focus at all times. The mantra of our own disability employee resource group is nothing about us without us, nothing without us at all. Certainly keeping them in view, whether you're doing things for the external community or for the internal community. Okay, here's another issue that we are probably all facing now, and with this I'll end my comments, and that is competing priorities. There are so many good things to do, and there is so little time. How do you make sure that accessibility stays front of mind? Particularly an issue in these large companies, which count by numbers. Did you create a feature in Google that's being used by 3 billion people the next day? That's a cause for celebration. How do you make sure that your accessibility features are getting the same level of recognition? And basically by changing how you measure impact, measuring impact in terms of the value that it has for the person, rather than a teeny tiny value that 2 billion people are getting. And so, again, just sort of changing heart share. With that, I'll pass back the microphone.
No, it's perfect. Thank you. I think that's a lead into you, isn't it, Hector, about that measuring as well, about the difference in when people are looking at the relationship building from that account manager, just keeping the focus on that particular part. It's not necessarily about the sale. That's what we were saying.
Sara's mentioned it just there. It's share of voice. It's like how much we've got all these different things to talk about: sustainability, accessibility, cloud, AI. Like, how much time do we spend talking about accessibility? So that is where leaders come in, super useful. I always remember really well one of our area presidents turned around in an all hands and said, "I want you all to put accessibility in your account plans." Great. I was very busy for a few months afterwards, right? So senior leaders make a big difference. In terms of what we're trying to do is we're trying to track those accounts and teams that are starting to kind of, see the wins, see the engagements. There's a big drive in any business, but essentially the size of Microsoft. We don't just sell into IT. We talk to HR just as much as we talk to IT nowadays, right? We talk to the CEO. The CEO is very involved in the digital strategy of their businesses nowadays, whereas 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that probably wasn't the case. So we're also kind of looking at how many people will attend accessibility sessions within our customer executive meetings. We're also measuring how many of our executive briefings have accessibility on the agenda. There's a lot of education. Sarah mentioned it really well. You've got to educate teams about why this is important and how it's advantageous to them to have these conversations. But then you have to do the measuring back so that product teams and things start to see that the thing they built is having an impact. Number of users is definitely one way to measure. The problem is you don't want to fixate on that. In an organization that's got a terrible culture around disability and isn't even having a conversation yet, well, of course you're going to have minimal use of the feature support, and you're probably going to have minimal representation of disability within an organization. But what you've got to get them is started on their journey to realize. Many companies that I've spoken to over the years, and partners actually, tech partners, have made very kind of blanket statements like, well, we don't employ anybody with a disability here. And you're just like, 3 months later, they're telling you, yeah, I've just found out a third of my employees are dyslexic. Yeah, thanks for the heads up, right? So it's like, you've got to kind of allow people to kind of get on their journey of learning and revelation, right? But training definitely, exec sponsors. Measuring impact is a great way to keep the programs running. Yeah. We now mandate training for all Microsoft employees across the globe, and they learn 3 things: what is disability, what technologies do people with disabilities use, and how do you build an accessible experience? Now, that can be anything from an event to an app, okay? But essentially, that's mandated learning now. Well, that wasn't mandated learning 2 years ago. Yeah. We didn't just turn that tap on straight away. Interestingly, now that we're kind of sharing our training journey on accessibility, government organisations are saying, oh, that's the bit we need. We need everybody to understand what is disability first, and then the other bits will happen. And so they kind of find this unlikely ally in Microsoft to kind of help them on that journey. But yeah, that's kind of how we measure.
I can see the clock. We've got to stop, sadly. I'm going to say a huge thank you to all of you for joining in. And just to pick up on the last piece about, I'm just thinking about a few other threads in TechShare Pro that we've had this year. Lots of people don't understand disability is actually the starting point of lots of these conversations, I think. That because their perception of what you're talking about is a little bit fuzzy, to say the least. They're not quite sure whether they should even start the conversation. And that's what I often hear. In lots of these things about the ecosystem, we feel like the people who know this stuff, but then the people opposite aren't trying to find it out. They're not, they're not even curious necessarily. They're just slightly fearful of it. And I think that education piece starts with that understanding what this is, as opposed to why it's relevant to you even, is it? Because that leveled playing field. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop because I've got 1 minute and 47 seconds. I won't have a chance to say thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. This could go on forever. I think the really interesting thing is this is an ecosystem. We've got people out on the network there. We've got 400 people watching this, right? So what we've done, I hope, is shown them that this is not a single little community of people who know each other and happen to sit together on stage, but all of these multiple threads. I mean, certainly for me, in the last couple of years, finding the connections and building in those sort of elements of connection that we've all described make you see that we can all play a separate role, and that, as you said, about being together. I think the final bit is really looking outside our bubble. It's hard to do that because nobody's listening and asking us for that information. We've got to find our route into that. We've got to be smart and creative about how we do that. We've got to share top tips. No, but we're not going to wait. We're going to be out there doing that work. So I think that ecosystem that we're in and the ecosystem that we're trying to influence, I think that's the picture we're trying to paint for people here, is that it's doable, we're making change, and it's going to happen. So thank you so much for joining us. Sarah, it's great to see you. Sumita, thank you very much for joining us. I'm sorry neither of you are in the room with us. I'm hopefully the next time we're in a room, you'll be in the room with us as well, possibly in Vienna. Thank you, Klaus. Thank you, Michal, and thank you, Hector. That was all fantastic and a huge range of ideas that people can take away. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.